is an old wish which, who knows how late, may some day be fulfilled, that instead of the endless manifoldness of civil laws, one may for once find their principles. For only in this can lie the secret to simplify, as one says, the legislation. Immanuel Kant. In my last lecture, I discussed what Kant calls private right or private law. That is, the right or the law as it should exist according to reason, independently of and even before there is a state who enforces it. And here Kant says that there are two different kinds of rights human beings have. There are innate rights and there are acquired rights. The innate rights are rights we are born with, rights we have simply by virtue of being human. So you could say they are, but nowadays gets called human rights. And there is not truly a plurality of innate rights. There really is just one, because all of right is about our faculty of choice, and all of right is about choosing only such actions that don't interfere with the freedom of other people's choice. So therefore, Kant would say there's only one innate right, one human right you're born with, and that is the right to freedom. And all these specific rights are just so many ways of expressing this, right? Like if someone were to kill you, that would take away your freedom. If someone were to maim you, that would take away your freedom. But it all comes down to freedom. But then on the other hand, there's the acquired rights. So rights we are not born with. Rights to certain property that we may acquire throughout life. And these can be acquired temporarily by physical possession, right? Simply because you take something in your hand, for example, which doesn't belong to anyone else, or simply because you stand on the ground that does not belong to anyone else. You now possess this object or this piece of ground, and no one can, but no one should, no one is allowed to take this from your hand or to push you off this ground. But this is not enough, of course, because this acquired right would only last as long as your physical possession of this thing lasts. So that means you would, for example, lose the right to your house as soon as you step out of the door. So therefore, there also needs to be what Kant would call intellectual property. So something being your property, even while you're not physically connected with it, simply because intellectually, that is, in the act of thinking, you, that is your free choice, is still connected to it. Which means that Kant is a proponent of juridical idealism, as he would call it, meaning that he believes, and I would assume many people believe that, that something can be your property not just by actually physically being connected to you, but also by a sort of virtual connection to you, by a connection that is not experienced, not seen necessarily, but only thought. So property can be ours through a sort of mental connection through an act of thinking. And this leads me to what I want to discuss here. Because the question is now, how does all of this work? How do we arrive at these rights that human beings have or can have? Well, to Kant, there are two types of judgments we can make: analytic and synthetic judgments. This distinction is immensely important to all of his philosophy, not just to his philosophy of right. And it is one of the key thoughts of Kant's that you need to understand if you want to understand anything Kant says. So therefore, I advise you to check out my much earlier lecture on that topic, the lecture on the project of the critique of reason: how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? To summarize briefly what I explained there in more detail, analytic judgments take a concept we already have and just analyze it. Just examine what is in that concept, so to speak. And therefore, through an analytic judgment, we don't gain new knowledge, new cognition, but we may gain more clarity. They are explaining judgments, as Kant says. While in a synthetic judgment, on the other hand, I actually do connect two concepts that beforehand were not connected with one another. And therefore, I actually gain new knowledge, which is why Kant calls them expanding judgments also. Right? So the judgment that a triangle has three angles, or that a father has at least one child, those would be analytic. They just explain what these concepts, triangle or father, mean. While raven are black, or 7 plus 5 equals 12, are synthetic judgments through which I expand my knowledge, right? I connect the concept of raven with the concept of black, and I learn something new. Now, when it comes to the rights, Kant would say that the innate rights can be deduced through an analytic judgment. I simply have to start with the principle of all right, that principle being that several free rational beings should be able to live alongside each other. So several beings that all have free choice should all act in such a manner that their choice, the actions they choose to do, does not interfere with others' choice, that they don't take away the free choice of others. If we simply take this principle and analyze what follows from that, then we realize that humans must have these innate rights. We realize that you mustn't murder someone, you mustn't rape someone, you mustn't kidnap someone, you mustn't maim someone, because all of these actions would clearly interfere with someone's choice. Now, when it comes to the acquired rights, we can also arrive at them analytically when we are talking just about the temporarily acquired right of the thing that I physically possess currently, right? If I'm out in nature and I pluck a fruit, let's say I pluck an apple from a tree that doesn't belong to anyone, and then while I'm holding that apple, I have an exclusive right to that apple. No one else has the right to forcefully take the apple from my hand if I refuse to give it to him. This again follows analytically, because now when I'm holding the apple, just taking it from me would once again interfere with my choice. And that is precisely what the principle of right forbids. So therefore it follows analytically that this mustn't be done. The problem arises when we come to the intellectual property. That is, what if I put the apple away and I go away and then later I come back, and in the meantime someone took the apple and ate the apple? That this is not okay. That even when I'm not physically connected anymore with the apple, it still belongs to me. And therefore, taking the apple is doing harm to me in some way, is interfering with my free choice in some way. That is not something that follows analytically from the principle of right. So here in this case, we need a synthetic judgment. That is, we need to make a connection that was not there before. We need to make a connection between my choice and an object, in this case the apple, but it could also be anything else, right? Or in other words, we need to expand our concept of property to go beyond that which is mine by birth, like my body, my abilities, or which is directly connected with what is mine by birth, as the apple I'm currently holding in my hand. We need to somehow expand the concept of property so that it includes also things as mine that have not been mine by birth and that are not directly connected with me, but that still somehow have become mine. So here is synthetic judgment is required. Well, and when it comes to synthetic judgments, there are 12 types of judgments we can make, Kant says. That is something he discusses already in his critique of pure reason. And there he presents a table of judgments. I have made a whole video on that, which you may check out. Kant would say there are 12 functions of judging, so there are 12 forms our judgments can take. This is simply due to the nature of our thinking faculty. This is simply how our thinking works, that all judgments we make must take up one of those 12 forms. And from these 12 forms of judgment, in his critique of pure reason, Kant deduces 12 categories, as he calls them. They are basic concepts of our intellect, concepts that we didn't just gain from experience. So a concept in Kant's terminology, I discussed this in more detail in the lecture on what is the intellect. A concept is really a sort. A concept is the sort of a rule, and it is that by which we understand. So if I have a concept of dog, it is what I'm thinking when I'm thinking of dogs, and I'm thinking a certain rule. For example, it includes that dogs are mammals, right? I'm thinking that all dogs, everything to which the concept dog applies, is a mammal. Or when I'm thinking the concept of house, Surely it applies to very different things, from small huts to skyscrapers, but it still describes certain rules that they all have in common. For example, as a rule, a house is a building. It is something that was built by humans, that doesn't exist just naturally, that wasn't grown, but rather that was built by humans. So we have lots of concepts that are empirical concepts, like the concept of dog. It's a concept that we got out of experience. But Kant would say that we do have these 12 basic concepts, like, for example, the concept of causality, which we have not actually gained from experience, but rather we have them a priori, that is before experience, and we can even only make experience because we have these concepts. And these 12 concepts Kant arrives at from the 12 functions of judgment, because since all our thinking happens in these 12 forms, if you sort of objectify these 12 forms of judging, you arrive at these 12 concepts, and Kant describes them in his table of concepts, which is also something about which I already gave a lecture, which you might check out first. Indeed, Kant says that all our thinking is connecting. That is one of Kant's of his most important insights, that thinking as such doesn't produce a material, it produces a form. The material comes from the senses. Our senses give us sensations, we perceive certain things, but then this manifoldness of sensations is connected only through thought. So let's go with this concept, this category of causality. You may see the sun shining on a stone, and you may feel when you touch the stone that it is hot. Those are two different perceptions, but the connection between them, the causal connection, that it is the sun that made the stone so hot, that is something that you don't perceive. It is something you think. Through your thinking, in these 12 manners Kant describes, you connect the data, so to say, that your senses give you. Now, when it comes to the right, or more specifically to acquired rights, to this intellectual property, this is also about connections, right? It is about how my choice, my faculty of choosing specific actions, is connected to specific objects. Something is my property because it is connected to my choice, because I want to have it, I want to be able to use it in some manners. And again, this is something that we don't perceive. We perceive possession only if someone is really holding the object in his hand, but lots of the times, like when someone is not currently in his house or on his bike or whatever, we don't directly perceive the connection, but we can still think this property connection. And to Kant, it follows that this thinking must also happen within these 12 categories. And that is why he, in his philosophy of right, has a table of the categories of right. This is part of Kant's architectonic method, which is another topic about which I've already given a lecture, which you might check out. And so to Kant, the architectonic is what really makes a science. Science to him is not about the content of what you have cognitions about. And it is also not so much about the way in which you arrived at a specific cognition, the way you found some specific knowledge. That is not what makes a cognition scientific. Rather, it's the relation to other cognitions. Um, Kant would say that the common cognitions, the non-scientific cognitions, they are like a pile of sand where every grain is independent of the others. While a science is like an organic body where every part is an organic part of the whole that has a specific place and that is needed and cannot just be absent, nor can it exist independently of the rest of the body. And so Kant would say that in science you need to be architectonic. If you just went around um, going with the legal science, going with the science of right, if you just went around thinking about what kind of rights could there be, what kind of rights could exist, maybe you can think of some, but maybe there are some rights that could possibly exist that you were not thinking of in that moment, that you overlooked. This is not scientific to Kant. Rather, in science, you should start from an architectonic principle that tells you what possible categories there are. So you know exactly what you're looking for, and you know when you are done because you have sort of filled in all the gaps that the architectonic described. So that is why he posits this table of categories of rights. And the 12 categories of rights, they are basically the same as the general 12 categories Kant describes. Which is why I very much recommend first checking out that lecture on the table of categories, because if you are familiar with Kant's table of categories, if you have understood it, sort of memorized it, then what I'm going to explain here, I think, will be very easy to understand. But if you're not familiar with it, then it will be very hard to understand and will be very confusing and will go over your head probably. Because these are not different categories. It's not like there are 24 categories now. They are the same 12 categories. It's just that in the table of categories, they are applied to thinking an object as such. So there Kant says, if we think of anything, doesn't matter what it is, if it's an empirical object like a stone, or if it's an idea like God, if we think of anything, it has to happen within these 12 categories. Now, this is about property. So now Kant is saying, when we are thinking of property, so we are not thinking of any object as such, but rather we are thinking of an object of choice that belongs to someone, then this has to happen within the following 12 categories. So there are 12 ways in which choice can be connected to an object. Both times, this is about the way our thinking faculty connects manifold things, manifold data, which again is all thinking ever does, connecting, giving forms. The difference is only that in the table of categories, Kant describes how manifold sense impressions are connected by our thinking through these 12 categories. While now, when it comes to his table of categories of right, the manifold being connected is the choice of different people. So this is about the 12 ways in which people can agree with one another about rights, about the mine and yours, as Kant calls us. So about what belongs to whom. So one time, our basic uh, concept is the concept of an object as such. Here now, our basic concept is the concept of an object of choice. Both times, the table of categories describes the 12 ways in which this basic concept can and must be solved. And here we have, however, an important difference between theoretical and practical philosophy in how exactly this works. How this works is a main question to Kant. How are synthetic judgments a priori possible? It's really the main question of Kant's whole critical project. It's really the central question, even the only question you could say, that he asks in his three main works, in his three critiques. And Kant would say, when it comes to theoretical philosophy, so when it comes to what he calls logical judgments, that synthetic judgments always require some sort of intuition, or as I like to call it, viewing. So you cannot just connect in your thinking alone two concepts, or rather you can do so, but it is an empty thought. You don't know if you have thought something or if you have thought nothing really. You don't know if there's any truth to what you are thinking. Rather, to be justified in connecting two concepts, you need to connect them within the same viewing. So when it comes to synthetic judgments a posteriori, that is some form of empirical viewing. So let's once again take the judgment that ravens are black. You can connect, of course, the concept of raven and black, but you could also connect the concept of raven and pink. This is just empty thinking. The reason you know that in one case this is right and justified, and in the other case it's not, is because of empirical viewing, because you have seen black ravens and you have not seen pink ravens, probably. But the viewing could also be not an empirical but a pure viewing. And that is indeed what happens in synthetic judgments a priori. Like, take the judgment that connects the concept of a straight line with the concept of the shortest possible connection between 2 points. Now, this judgment, the shortest possible connection between 2 points is a straight line, is a judgment that once again requires viewing. Not necessarily empirical viewing. You don't need to have seen this in experience. You don't need to necessarily take a piece of paper and actually draw the straight line connecting two dots to see that this is the shortest possible connection. You can also do this just in your imagination. But you do need to do more than just think. You cannot, from simply thinking what the definition of straight line and what the definition of shortest possible connection is, you cannot really arrive at the connection between these two concepts. You need to at least imagine it in space, these 2 points, and at least imagine possible connections between them to see that the shortest possible one is the straight line. Now, this is when it comes to logical judgments, so when it comes to theoretical philosophy. The big difference is that in practical philosophy, when it comes to practical judgments, it's the other way around, Kant says. Here, we don't need sensuality to underlie our judgments. Here we don't need some sort of viewing in order to be able to make synthetic judgments, even synthetic judgments a priori, but rather, in order to make a synthetic judgment a priori, we need to abstract from all sensuality. Right? This is true for morality. This is true when it comes to the moral law, the categorical imperative. And I discussed this in my lecture on do we have free will? That Kant would say, if I stick to sensuality in the realm of the practical, I will never arrive at a moral law. From what my senses perceive, they don't perceive a shall. They don't perceive how I ought to act, but only how I want to act, that I desire happiness. And here, like an animal, I would just follow my desires, and the only difference to an animal would be that I would do it in a more rational manner. So here, reason would forever be just an instrument, helping me as a means to an end, helping me to arrive at whatever I desire. But reason would never set the goal as such. That would be set by sensuality. And only when I abstract from my sensuality, only then can I make a judgment, a synthetic judgment a priori, that I should act in a certain manner, where reason doesn't just give me the means of reaching a goal, but gives me the goal itself, the goal of the good. And here, what I need to make a connection between two concepts, to synthesize, is not that they come together in some form of viewing and therefore some sort of sensuality, but here what I need is that they come together in some sort of idea and therefore in something supersensual. Namely, when it comes to the categorical imperative, and that's what I discussed on the lecture on free will, it is the idea of freedom. Through the idea of freedom, we can make this connection with our will and our duty, that we should act in a certain manner. Now, the same is true here, Kant says, when it comes to the right. The connection that I make is not one that requires sensuality, because again, as I already discussed in my previous lecture, if I stick to sensuality when it comes to rights, I can never go beyond the right to my own body and what is directly connected to my body. When I stick to sensuality when it comes to possession, I can never go beyond saying my possession that no one else may take is only what I actually physically, literally possess. And as soon as I don't possess it anymore, it stops being mine and it is free for the taking. I need here too to abstract from sensuality and to make a supersensual, merely intellectual connection between my choice and some object. And this too is only possible through an idea. And in this case, it is the idea of the united choice of various free beings, right? I have this idea of our free choice that could choose any actions and could therefore also choose actions where we interfere with one another. But I can have this idea of our free choice aligning. Like when I say this apple tree is mine, no one else is allowed to pluck apples from it, to cut it down. But then this apple tree over there, that is yours. So I will keep away from it and you can do with it whatever you want. And then you agree with that and say, okay, if this apple tree over there is mine and you stay away from it, then I will agree to stay away from this one and to accept it as yours. So our free choice now aligns. We choose the same to accept this as my property and this as your property. And of course, in reality, not all people always agree. Otherwise, there would be no crimes, right? Crime like stealing means that someone with his choice does interfere with my choice. But it is at least possible. It is at least thinkable. It is certainly not against the laws of nature that all people could fully agree on the mine and yours, on what belongs to whom, who has which right. And it is this idea of the agreement of the free choice through which I can connect my choice, the concept of my choice, with the concept of a specific object and say, this is my property, because it's not something I declare. It's not just that I want it to be my property, but everyone, even if not everyone does agree, everyone could agree that this should be my property and this should be given to me. But now let's go through what Kant calls the table of the categories of rightful property, or the table of the categories of the possibility of common, of unified, of aligned choice. Like the general table of categories, here too you have the 12 categories making up 4 different titles of 3 categories each. And these in turn being ordered into 2 classes of 2 titles each, and therefore of 6 categories each. The mathematical categories here are concerned with the freedom of choice of each person and the form in which they are, the choices of the people are connected. First, you have the 3 categories of quantity. So they are concerned with, the quantity of choices. That is, how many free choices, talking about the faculties of choice, so how many persons with their choice come together and align in denoting something as someone's intellectual property. First off, Kant says something can become your property simply by you alone, with your choice, choosing it to become yours. So you can, for example, go into the forest where things don't belong to anyone, and you can pluck a fruit from a tree, and you can say, this is now mine. And I want this to stay mine, even if I give it out of my hand again, even if I lay it down for a moment. I have now declared this is now my property, and anyone who takes it steals it. So something can become yours by right through one-sided choice. Kant says this is clearly connected to the category of unity, right? Because the 3 categories of quantity are usually unity, plurality, and totality. The problem here is, of course, that if there's only one-sided choice, this can create only what Kant calls provisional right. So you want this to be yours. You declare this to be yours by right now, to now have an exclusive right to this object. But since no one else has agreed with you, nothing's really stopping other people from disregarding this choice of yours. Second, relating to the category of plurality, we have not one-sided choice, but so to say multi-sided choice. This is if you have a contract or an agreement. So something can be rightfully yours because your faculty of choice and another person's faculty of choice agreed that this is yours. So the other person agrees to leave this to you. Maybe he gifted it to you, maybe he sold it to you in return for something else. But the point is that here it's not just you declaring, okay, this apple should be mine, but rather it is also somebody else declaring, yes, this should be yours. Maybe because you in turn said, and therefore this money shall be yours. But here you have a second or maybe also a third or so, however many people may be involved in this contract and this agreement. You have a second person agreeing that something is your property, that something is your right. But it is only a right you have in the eye of that second person you came to an agreement with. If there's another third person who is not part of that contract, he still didn't agree. So in his eyes, this still isn't your property, right? Imagine you are stranded on a lone island with another person, and you decide to and you choose to divide up the island between you, and you draw a line in the middle, and you agree that each half belongs to one person and the other person mustn't step onto it, and you both honor that agreement. But now let's say a third person is stranded on the island, and he comes onto your side of the island, and you now complain, no, this is mine by rights. This side of the island is my property. You can't step here without my permission. That third person could then say, no, not for me. You only agreed with the other guy. He gave this side of the island to you, but I never agreed to this. So I'm not breaching your right because I never accepted this right in the first place. Which leads to the last category of quantity, the one relating to the category of totality. And that is something being mine by law. So, not being mine through my own choice and action, which can only be provisional. Also, not being mine through some sort of pact, some sort of agreement, which can only make it mine in the eyes of that other person who made a contract with me, but something being mine lawfully. And only this can create a true universal right. Only this can really make it rightfully mine, Kant would say, because the law is in place for everyone who is under that law, everyone who is part of that legal community, now needs to accept that this is my property and my property alone, because the law says so, and the law that compels them to accept this object as my property also compels me to accept other objects as their property. The quantity just described how many choices, how many people's faculty of choice are obliged. But the question is, of course, obliged to what? And this is what the categories of quantity are about. In what way are they obliged? Because the categories of quantity in the general table of categories are reality, negation, and limitation. And likewise, when property is in question, when uh, we are talking about property, I can acquire the right to some property. I can also relent the right of some property, or the right to some property can be limited. And these three, these three categories of quality um, directly correspond and map onto the three categories of quantity. Because if I one-sidedly, with my choice, declare this object that beforehand belonged to no one to now be mine, and declare that I want everyone else to accept that this is mine and that I have an exclusive right to this object, then this is me acquiring a right. But again, just a provisional right, because others have not agreed with me yet, right? Secondly, if I make an agreement with somebody else, and as part of that agreement, I give him something, it means that this something before must have been mine, or else I could not have rightfully given it, but now it becomes his, meaning this corresponds to the category of negation, right? I negate my right to it. This is what giving, no matter whether it's gifting or whether it's selling, means, right? It means saying, till now this was mine, so I had the right to do with it whatever I wanted, to use it however I wanted. But now I give up that right. And now I agree, maybe just because I want so, because it's a gift, or maybe because you have paid me for it, whatever. But I do agree, for whatever reason, that from now on I no longer have a right to this thing, and I will let you take this thing and do with it whatever you want. I give you that right. And lastly, we again have the law that applies to everyone, and the law limits the rights of people with their free choice to objects. Here, my use of an object is limited by other people's rights, right? Under a state of law, I can use any object I want, except all the objects that belong to other people, where they have a right to them. And they, in turn, can also use every object, except all the objects that belong to other people, like to me, for example. So the rights of one person limit the rights of all other people, but their rights in turn also limit the right of that one person. But now let's move from the mathematical class to the dynamical class, which is about the reality of choice. So here the question is, what does my choice relate to? What materially do I have a right to? Independently of the question of how many people agree that I have this right, or whether it's me gaining a right or abstaining from a right, but to what? What is actually the material content of my right? That is what the dynamic class is concerned with. And here, most important are the three categories of relation, because that is the main question, right? What does my right, what does my choice relate to? and it is this which needs the most explanation, and it is also this which is most important, because ultimately Kant divides private right, or at least the acquired private rights, according to these three categories of relation, into the item rights, the personal rights, and the rights to the personal rights in the manner of an item. So what does that mean? Let's start with item rights. The item rights are rights to, well, items, to non-rational objects that I may own. In German, Kant says Sachenrecht, which I translate as item right. You could also translate it, and that I looked up how it's usually translated. That also seems to be done as real right. Real here, of course, in the sense you use the word real estate, so real not in the sense of existing, but coming from the Latin word res, which just means a thing, an object, or an item. So indeed, Kant, who always gives Latin terms, also translates the German Sachenrecht as jus reale into Latin. What is meant here is once again the right of ownership to any possible object that is not a rational being. So it could be a lifeless object, like when you own a bike or a house. It could also be a living object, like when you own a plant or when you own an animal. All of these Kant considers items within his philosophy of right. In practical philosophy, all objects, everything that exists, is divided by Kant into persons and items, where person refers to any object that is rational, that has autonomy, and so human beings, possibly also aliens if we met some. So therefore, any being that has rights and that therefore also has duties, while item refers to any non-rational, any non-autonomous being, any being that therefore has no rights and also no duties. I already explained the issue of translating in my lecture on human dignity, where I already talked about person and item. I think most translators translate it with the word Sing. But the thing is that in German there's the word Ding and there's the word Sache. And Ding, which is literally the same word as Sing, is used by Kant as a more general umbrella term. So everything is a Ding. And then he divides the Dinge into persons and Sachen. So therefore, to somehow have this distinction, I have decided to translate Sache with item to better differentiate it from the more general term Sing, which would be Ding in German. But anyways, here you find Kant often criticized, at least nowadays, not so much in his days, but since nowadays people are more concerned with animals. They talk about animal rights, about how you mustn't abuse animals and so on. And especially people who do care for animals have criticized Kant for saying that animals are items, or that animals are just things, as it is often translated. but I will get into that in its own lecture. I will give a lecture on what Kant says specifically about animals and how we should treat animals. But I already want to stress here that I think a lot of this criticism comes from simple misunderstanding. People hear animals being called mere things or items, and they think that it means that Kant is completely ignorant and careless towards animals, that to him there is no difference between an animal and a stone, and he completely disregards that animals are not just biological robots, that they can feel pain. But all of that is not the point to Kant. These to him are legal terms. And in his legal theory, there are only persons and items. And again, anything that is not rational, that has no autonomy and therefore has neither rights nor duties, is an item. And it is only items which can be owned. Persons cannot be owned. If you were to own a person, that would be slavery, and that would be immoral precisely because this is a person with its own autonomy, and you mustn't reduce the person to an item. But owning an item is fine. And if you consider the term like this, it should not be so controversial, because apart from some very extremist animal rights people, most people, even most vegetarians and most vegans, would probably agree that it is okay to own an animal. Just like you may own a lifeless object, right? It is okay that dogs or cats or fish or whatever are bought and sold, and did we own them, like that we put the dog on a leash, that we choose for the dog where he goes, what he does. Most people would not criticize this. So indeed, in that sense, in the legal sense, the dog is just as much an item as the bike is. And this is all that Kant means. So the item right refers to the right to non-rational, non-autonomous objects that may be owned. And this right is in the table of categories, it has the place of the category, the first category of relation, that is the category of substance and accidents. So, right, usually we think one of the three sorts of relations we can think is the relation a thing has with its own accidents, that is, with its own attributes. Like, for example, the relation that the stone has with hardness, or the relation that the grain of sugar has with sweetness. And Kant puts the item right here with this category, substance and accidents, because he says in legal terms, an item that I own is like an accident of mine. Of course, only in legal terms, not in ontological terms. Clearly, ontologically, my bike is not just an accident of mine, like the red color is an accident of the t-shirt, because an accident cannot exist independently of its substance, right? Redness as such cannot exist. It can only exist on a red object like the t-shirt. Of course, the bike can exist independently of me. So this is, of course, not ontologically speaking, but legally speaking, it is as if the bike was an accident to me as a person who is the substance. And this means that anyone who harms an item that I own, like anyone who does damage to my bike or my house or whatever, or anyone who steals that item, it is as if he had harmed me as a person, right? In legal terms, it is no different whether you cut somebody's hair off or cut his finger off against his will, or whether you steal somebody's bike. In both cases, you have, in legal terms, done damage to him. And this is precisely why, to Kant, right, we have these innate rights to our own freedom. Even if we didn't own anything else, we would own that which we are born with, like our body. So we have this right we are born with to not be harmed in our accidents. No one has a right to change our accidents, that is, to change our state without our consent. Well, therefore, if something becomes like our accident, if some object becomes in legal terms parts of me, now it can also be deduced from this innate right to myself, that I have a right to this object, that no one may, for example, steal this object. Of course, it must be pointed out, I must remind you, that all of right, that this whole table of categories of right, is about the connection between people's faculty of choice. It is about the synthesis of choice. I acquire a right to something because I, with my choice, want to have this thing, and others, with their choice, agree that I should have this thing. So therefore, there can be no legal connection with an object that has no choice. That is, there can be only legal connections with other persons and not with items. What this means is that I have rights to items, like I have a right to own this item, which is mine, but I have no right towards items. I only have rights towards other people. So while this first category of rights is called item rights, it means that they are rights about items, they are rights to items, but they are still rights I have in regards to other persons, and they are still rights granted to me by other persons, right? What this means is that if you were on a lone island, not only would there be no personal right, there would also be no item right. You would have no right to the things on this island. You could not say that these are yours by right, that you are the rightful owner. All you could say is that these things are completely unowned, and therefore it is not against the right for you to use them. But you cannot be truly a rightful owner if there's no one else agreeing and granting you that right. Rights only arise when you have several people living together. I mean, anything else would not make sense. If we were to say that we have a right not just to an item, but towards the item, it would mean that the item has an obligation towards me. That would mean that, for example, if my car starts rolling down a hill, I could then sue my car and demand from my car that it come back to me. Or it would mean that if my dog runs away, or a bird I keep in a cage flies away, I could now sue the animal and demand that it come back to me. That would, of course, be ridiculous. I have no right towards this item. I have a right towards other persons in regards to this item. So that means that Somebody else, of course, cannot steal my car or cannot steal my pet against my will. And if they do, then I can demand it being returned. But I cannot demand that from the object as such. I will point out that this is one of the instances where I think Kant should have noticed that the philosophy of right is its own thing and is not just a subcategory of morals. I talked about this in my lecture on the difference between right and ethics, that to Kant they both together make up morality, and that here with Fichte I would disagree and I would vote for distinguishing them more clearly. And I think this is one of the instances where it shows, because on a lone island there is no right, but there's still morality. And Kant himself would agree. He would say that morality is just about the goodwill, and you can always have a goodwill, right? Even if there's no one around. Surely certain ways the goodwill expresses itself in actions would not happen if you were alone. Like, you would not end up saving anyone's life if there was no one whose life could be in danger. But you could still have the goodwill that potentially, if it came across someone whose life was in danger, would without hesitation help and try to save him. And Kant would say that even on your own, you still have moral duties. Even if you have no duties towards others, you would still have duties towards yourself. And even on your own, you can still inwardly have a righteous attitude, and you can still live a dignified life as a human being. So morality doesn't require other people being around, but right does. So therefore they should be separated. But be that as it may, let's move on to the second category of relation, which is the category of causality. And here in the table of categories of rights, we have personal right. So while item right or real right is rights we have to items, to non-rational objects, the personal right is now rights we have to persons, so to people who do have autonomy. Now Kant stresses that another person, precisely because personhood is defined by having autonomy, cannot ever be my property, because that would take his autonomy away and therefore deprive him of his personhood. And this is something there could be no agreement about, right? All of right is about the free choice of people aligning and agreeing. And rightful property can only be that which, at least in theory, everyone can agree should be my property. But when it comes to a person, there's no conceivable state in the world where everyone agrees that this person should be mine. Maybe some people would agree, like maybe some third person could agree that this second person should be mine. He could say, I don't care if you enslave this guy, but at least that person himself would probably never agree. So therefore, I cannot possibly own a person. However, Kant says, I can own the effects of a person. I can own a person's effectiveness in the world, or at least part of it. That is, I can own a person's action. And that happens through a contract if a person promises to do certain actions for me. So again, if you go with the first category of relation, the category of substance and accident, then you could say that a person can never be owned in his substance. But certain actions that a person may take, to that I can have ownership. They can become my property if the person promises them to me. And this is why this relates to the category of causality, right? I can own not the person as such, but I can own the person's causality. So usually you, with your choice, are the cause, and then your action is the effect, right? Like, let's say you want to build a house for yourself, then your choice to build a house is the cause, and you building the house is the effect. Well, when there's a contract, then suddenly another person's choice is the cause, not your own choice anymore. And again, your action is the effect. Like if you are a construction worker and you have a contract with that other person to build him a house, maybe you yourself are not particularly interested in building that house. Maybe you would rather do something else. But now it is not your own choice anymore that determines your action. It's the other person's choice, because you have made a contract that your actions, your effectiveness, should be subjected not to your own choice anymore, but to his choice, at least in this one manner. And when you compare these two types of rights, so again, Kant says there's the item right, where I actually own an item, where it becomes like an accident to my substance. And there's the personal right, where I don't own the person, but I own certain actions of that person, because the person made a promise, made some sort of contract with me to work for me in some way. Then what is important is that these can never be switched, right? So when it comes to items, you can own the item, but you cannot own certain actions or certain effects from the item, right? That would be absurd. Otherwise, you could, if your house that you own suddenly falls down, you could now sue your house. Or if your dog that you own refuses to follow your commands, you could now sue your dog. Of course, you cannot do that. Maybe you can sue the person who sold you the house or who built you the house, because they built a shitty house. But that would then again not follow the item right, but the personal right, right? The person promised to build you a house that lasts, and he built you a house that broke down as soon as a little wind came. So maybe you can now sue that person, but you cannot sue the house because you own the item, but you don't own a certain effect that the item might have. While on the other hand, when it comes to personal right, you can only own certain actions a person might do, but you can never own the person as such. That is very important, and Kant stresses it a lot. Maybe nowadays it needs to be stressed less. Maybe for us it is more self-evident. But you should remember that Kant lived in the 18th century. So that was a time when, in large parts of the world, slavery was a daily reality. The Europeans, not so much in Europe itself, but outside of Europe, in the colonies, held slaves. But even in Europe, while there was no slavery, there was still serfdom. And that was something that in the age of Aufklärung, in the 18th century in Germany, not only in Germany, of course, was very controversial, was very much discussed, and the Aufklärer, people like Kant and other thinkers, very much argued against it, very much said that this is not right. And indeed, they were successful. at the end of the Age of Aufklärung, at the end of the 18th century or at the start of the 19th century, serfdom was abolished. I mean, not in Tsarist Russia, there took several more decades, they were very backwards, but in other places, in Germany. In Prussia, where Kant lived, in 1799, serfdom was abolished in the royal domains, so the serfs that were serfs directly of the king stopped being serfs. And in the following years and decades, also the serfs that were serfs of other people, not directly the king, but serfs of some nobles, were also freed. That happened in the years after Kant's death. Kant died in 1804. So this is something that was quite important to Kant, and it is something that should be noted, because nowadays Kant is often accused of having been racist. I will talk about the merit of that accusation in its own lecture. When I get to what Kant says about natural science, then I will also get to what he says about different human races. But I think it is important to point out, and that I want to point out here already, that whatever Kant may have said on the theoretical side about there being different human races who maybe have different abilities and therefore are not equal in what they can do, to him that had no practical consequences. At no point does he say, okay, and since the black race has less intellectual capabilities, that makes them subhumans, and that makes it right to subjugate and to enslave them. No, he again and again stresses that no human being, that all humans share the same dignity. It's not dependent on how smart somebody may be, and that therefore no human being must be owned like cattle by another human being. And an acquaintance of Kant reports how Kant said it makes him sick in the stomach to think of the terrible, inhumane condition that the serfs in his own country of Prussia lived in. Kant says at some point in his own private notes, "Someone like that is for himself like nothing but a household tool of another. I might just as well show reverence to the boots of the master as to his servant. In short, the human being which is dependent is no longer a human being. He lost that rank. He is nothing but an accessory of another human being." But there's still the third category of relation, which is the category of community or mutual action, or the category of the whole and its parts. And this leads Kant to posit that there's one more type of right, apart from the item right, the jus reale, and the personal right, the jus personale. There's also, he says, jus realiter personale, which, or in German, the auf dingliche Weise persönliches Recht, which you could translate as the personal right in the manner of an item. Now, this sounds strange, and it will probably sound even more strange when I say what it is, because Kant says it is the right to own a person as yours, akin to the manner you own an item, without, however, that person stopping to be a person. Now, this sounds strange, and it seems to contradict what I just said about Kant very strongly being against slavery or being against serfdom, about Kant saying you cannot make a person an item and own a person like an item. But to Kant, there's a strong difference here. in slavery, the person really stops being a person and really becomes an item. Of course, I'm speaking in legal terms from the perspective of the slaver. In truth, of course, the person remains a person, which is precisely the reason why slavery is immoral, right? If the slave really somehow stopped being a person and truly became cattle, then it would no longer be immoral to enslave him. It is immoral because he stays a person and it is against his personhood. But at least in the legal framework of the slaveholder society, the slave is no person at all. He's just as much an item as cattle is. And that means you own him completely and you can use him however you want and you can abuse him and you can even kill him. And that, of course, is immoral. But that is not what Kant is thinking of when he's talking about this personal right in the manner of an item. Rather, he is thinking of what we could call domestic relations. Indeed, Kant gives 3 examples. That is marriage, the relationship between parents and their children, and the relationship between the lord of a household and the members of that household, whereby Kant means domestic servants that live with you, or also grown-up children that still live at home, because Kant would say that the moment children are old enough, independent enough to hypothetically take care of themselves and feed themselves, they stop being their parents' subjects simply by virtue of being their children. The parents, as parents, now no longer have rights over them. But if those children don't move out yet to make their own household, if they choose to voluntarily still live in their parents' household, then they now switch from the status of children, so to say, to the status of voluntary servants, who also are under the authority of the house father, but not because he's their biological father, but because this is his household and they are accepted as living there, but it is still his. I will point out that these 3 sorts of relationships that Kant describes here, they are not random. It's not that Kant randomly gives 3 examples, and maybe there could also be a 4th or a 5th kind of relationship that also falls under this personal right in the manner of an item. But rather, these 3 once again are deduced from the table of categories, I would say. Because while the personal right in the manner of an item as such, as a certain type of right, belongs to the 3rd category of relation, that does not mean that within that type of right, the different kinds of relationships that this type of right applies to cannot also, in turn, belong to different categories. This is where things get a little more complicated or a little more interesting. Like the table of categories can be more intricate, right? It's not just, okay, this belongs to one category and now we are done. But within one category, you can also sometimes, again, divide things according to different categories. And I would say that if you think about it, this is not something Kant says, but if you think about it, these 3 types of relationships seem to also correspond to the 3 categories of relation, right? So marriage being related to substance and accident, because here the two married people stop in a way being two independent persons, and in a way they become one, um, being just an accident of the other person. And then the relationship of parents and children is obviously related to the category of causality, the parents being the cause of the children. And lastly, the relationship with the domestic servants is related to the category of the whole and the parts, right? The whole household, they are parts of that household. Now, these are my thoughts, how they relate to the categories of relation. Kant himself also connects these three relationships to the three categories of modality, which are possibility, existence, and necessity. And he says that in marriage, you have the possibility of creating human beings, of procreating. In the parent-child relationship, you deal with the reality of that creation, like human beings have been created. And then lastly, in the third type of relationship with the housemates, like with the grown children or with the servants, you have the necessity of obedience, Kant says, to the father, to the lord of the household, because of the need for being provided for. But anyways, those are the three kinds of relationships that he describes that, according to him, fall under this third type of right, the personal right in the manner of an item. Now, the way Kant describes this personal right in the manner of an item, it means a right to a person where not that person is your property, again, that would be slavery, but that person's state. So again, if we put this into proper terms, if we go with the first category of relation, substance and accidents, you could say that the person's substance is not yours, right? Therefore, you cannot kill the person, for example, but the person's accidents are yours. You own the state of that person, meaning you can, for example, decide where that person should be at a given time. You can also choose what actions that person should do. Maybe you can even choose outer things about that person, like how that person dresses, or that person should cut their hair, or whatever. You Again, the person as a substance is not under your ownership, but the accidents of that person, the state of that person, that is something you own. Because you take care of that person and that person's state, you protect that person, you provide for that person. And to Kant, this means that the personal right in the manner of an item is a right to, when it comes to the form of ownership, own a person like you would own an item. But when it comes to the material, that is the content of it, that is the use you make of that which you own, then you don't have the right. That is what differentiates it from slavery. You don't have the right to own, to use that person like you would use an item. Rather, you still must treat that person as a person. But the form of ownership is akin to how you would own an item. And to Kant, one instance where you can see this sort of right in action, so to say, is that person which you own in that manner cannot choose themselves where they want to be, right? So when you have an item, you choose where that item is, right? You choose where to put your item. And of course, nobody else is allowed to steal it from you. Like if somebody else steals your bike or your car, then if that thief is found, the state will confiscate what was stolen and will give it back to you. But not only that, if you somehow lose your item, you also have a right to get it back, right? Like if you have an animal that you own and that animal somehow runs away, then the state, the lawgiver, does not say, okay, clearly that animal does not want to be with you and that's its own choice, so let it be. But even if that animal was not stolen but ran away on its own, you still have a right to catch it and to take it back. And the same, Kant would say, is true here when it comes to this personal right in the manner of an item. If your wife or your child or your servant does not want to be with you anymore and runs away, not just if they are abducted. I mean, that is clear anyways, that the state would try to find the kidnapper and to free them again. But also when they themselves chose to run away, you have a right, so to speak, to catch them and to get them back. Now, clearly today, this third type of right might be more controversial or might cause some irritation on material grounds. That is simply because these sorts of relationships have changed, at least the marital relationship and the servant relationship. I think it is important here to understand what Kant is thinking of, to understand the reality of his time. Let's first start with marriage. Marriage back then was not the same thing it is now, right? Back then, and when I say back then, I'm not just thinking of Kant's day, like over 200 years ago. This was not so long ago. This is still living memory. This was just some decades ago. Like my grandmother, of course, I'm now speaking from the German perspective, from the laws that were in place in Germany, but I would assume that many other countries in the past had similar laws. My grandmother, this was after the Second World War. This was like in the 50s and 60s when officially our constitution already said that both sexes are equal. Still, from the moment she was married, she had no right to work unless she had the permission of her husband to work. She had no right to open a bank account. She had no right to sign a contract, not even her children's grades. Like in Germany, when the child gets a certificate with the grade at the end of the year, the parents have to sign it. This is really just a small signature that is pretty meaningless, just proves that the parents have seen it. But even that, she could not do herself. Her husband needed to do that. And also, likewise, this was abolished at the start of the 70s when, for the first time, the Social Democrats got into power. But then also, till the 90s, so till pretty much when I was born, you still in Germany had the right to rape within marriage. I mean, of course, it was not called that, but it simply wasn't considered rape, right? Sex was considered a marital duty, so you didn't really have a right to refuse your spouse. And only in the 90s was this changed. And back then, when in the German parliament they voted on this, there were politicians, mainly of the Conservative Party, of course, who voted against this. And there are still politicians sitting in parliament now who back then, 30 years ago, voted against rape within marriage becoming illegal. In fact, one such politician is currently our chancellor. And also, likewise, for a long time, divorce was not so simple. You couldn't just say, oh, I don't want to be married to that person anymore, so I'm filing for divorce. But rather, you needed what the state considered a proper reason. Like, for example, your spouse not being faithful, cheating on you. But simply not wanting to be married anymore was not considered a valid enough reason. So, with all of that in mind, I think if Kant lived nowadays and would look at our current laws, he would probably say that marriage doesn't exist anymore. That marriage as such was abolished, and that thing which mainly for reasons of tradition is still called marriage is really nothing but some sort of registered life partnership where the two people are not truly married, still remain completely independent from each other and just happen to live together, happen to have sex, happen to maybe have children, and just notify the state of this, notify the state that we, these two independent people, have chosen to currently be together. We might also choose to separate again. Please give us tax benefits. But this is not a true marriage in the true legal sense, Kant would say. And likewise, the relationship with the servants. Of course, nowadays you still have some people who pay others for cooking for them or for cleaning their home. I mean, it's certainly less common than in Kant's days, where at least amongst the nobility and the wealthy bourgeoisie, it was completely normal to have these house servants. But surely, still, people hire other people to do services for them. But this, Kant would say, nowadays is happening only according to personal right. So now we are again in the second category of the categories of relations, not in the third. This service in the third category is also something that has been abolished. But you must consider that in Kant's days, this was completely normal and widespread. I mean, Kant himself had a cook and also a servant that lived with him. You had these servants living with you that didn't just have a contract with you to do a specific service for you, but rather they were really considered part of your household, and you were really responsible for them. And this came with lots of rights. This came with the right to punish them if they misbehaved in your mind. This came with the right to keep them. Like, they couldn't just one day choose to not work for you anymore and to leave your service. And no, rather, they needed your permission. If they just ran away, even if you mistreated them, they could not just run away. If they were caught by police forces, they would be sent back to you. And these servants even needed permission to marry. You couldn't just, if you were someone's servant living at his home, you couldn't just marry someone you wanted to marry. You first needed the permission of the head of household. So this is the kind of relationship Kant is thinking of here. To Kant, the main difference when it comes to servants between someone serving you according to personal right, because he has contractually agreed to do certain actions for you, and someone serving you according to the personal right in the manner of an item, because he's your house servant. The main difference is that in the former case, someone is doing a specific service for you. Like you hire someone to cook for you, or you hire someone to clean for you. That is what you agree on contractually. And that is therefore also the only thing you can demand from him, because he hasn't agreed to anything else. While these house servants that existed in Kant's days, they just agree to serve you, period. They don't agree to just one specific action, like to just clean or whatever, but rather when they come into your service, they agree to do anything for you. And now you have complete freedom what sort of commands you want to give them. They need to do anything now that you command them to do, of course within the framework of legality. Of course, you could not demand from your servant that he kills somebody else, but any legal action you could demand from them. So nowadays, at least, the relation of marriage and the relation of the domestic servant in this form do not really exist anymore. But even apart from that, apart from these more material objections, you could, of course, object on completely formal grounds to this type of right Kant talks about. And indeed, even in his own day, there was criticism of this type of right, so that he felt compelled in the second publication of his Doctrine of Right to address the criticism in a footnote. But Kant would say that he discovered this sort of right following his architectonic method. Like the item right and the personal right, that's not things Kant came up with. Including these names, like the German Sachenrecht and persönliches Recht, or especially the Latin jus reale or jus personale. Those were in the legal theories of the 18th century, those were commonplace. All Kant is doing here is basically giving them a place in his table of categories, associating them with the first two categories of relation. But then, and this is precisely his architectonic method, since the table of categories has, so to say, three open slots, Kant says that even though the legal scholars of his time knew only of the item right and of the personal right, within human reason, if we think things through, there is space for one more sort of right. Even if it was not practiced, like even if there was no society on earth that did have such rights, it was still a sort of right we could at least conceive of, a sort of right that we could at least imagine being practiced. But what Kant is saying is that it is indeed being practiced in these three relationships of marriage, parenthood, and servitude, domestic servitude. And maybe we can say, before we reject this completely, that even today, at least the second type of relationship, that between parents and children, still functions according to this, even though nobody would call it that nowadays, but according to this personal right in the manner of an item. Because indeed, you could say that parents do own their children like items, even though, of course, they have no right to use them like items. So formally, it is like the relationship to an item. Materially, it is not. Of course, it could also be materially. That has happened in human history, right? There have been instances where children were owned and ruled much in the same manner as slaves, which meant that the father even had the right to kill his children, right? The father was sort of an absolute tyrant at home, and if he wanted um, to kill his child, like maybe because the child was disabled or something, he had every right to do so. Of course, Kant would be against that, because that again would put the child in the parent's ownership according to the item right. And that must never happen with a human being. But the child can be under the parents, Kant would say, according to the personal right in the manner of an item. That is, formally, the child can be owned like an item, even though materially it cannot be used like an item. And again, um, this means that the parents can rule not over the person but over the state of the child, right? They can tell the child what to do, like go clean your room. They can forbid certain things from the child, like no, you can't play on your PlayStation today. They can even control the child's body, the state, in some degree, like they can cut the child's hair even if the child doesn't want it. And most importantly to Kant, they have this right over the child's location, right? Just like used to be the case with the wife or the servant, with the child it still is the case that not just if it is abducted will the state bring it back to you, but even if it runs away of its own choice, if the child doesn't want to be with you anymore, it has no choice over the matter. It is the parents determining where the child should be, and a child that runs away is brought back to the parents. So it seems that, at least in this second regard, we do indeed practice this personal right in the manner of an item. But with that, let's go to the last title. Let's go to the categories of modality, which, of course, as I already said, are possibility, existence, and necessity. And this is about the modality of the unity between people's choice, right? Um, so, first off, it is possible for people's choice to align. That is the case with the provisional right? That is the case if I just take an object and say this should be mine, nobody else with his choice has yet agreed that this should be mine and they will stay away from this object, but they could. It is possible. If it was impossible, then this would clearly be unjust, right? Everything that is legally impossible, so everything that is not possible that everyone else could agree, is unjust. So that would once again be the case with slavery, right? If I point to not some item but to another human being and say this is mine, this belongs to me now, it is not possible that everyone, including that person himself, agree with that. So therefore it is clearly an unjust action. Secondly, if we have a contract, like in the personal right, then it is not just possible, but it actually is the case that someone agrees with me about a right I should have. It's not just me saying I should have a right to this action, I should have a right to demand this action from you. But since the other person signed a contract, he also with his choice agreed that I now have a right to this action. And lastly, when we get out of the state of nature, when we actually do have a state with laws, then under law, you have the necessity of agreement of all the people's free choice. Of course, it is not necessary that a law as such exist. People could also remain in the state of nature. People could never form a social contract. People could never form a state. They could remain without laws. But if there should be a law, then in order for there to be a law, it is necessary that all the free choices are in agreement. That is exactly what the law demands from them. Now, after having went through all the 12 categories of right, I want to point out that much more so than in the general ontological table of categories, here the seemingly 12 categories come down really to 3, because the 3 under each title always seem to very much correspond to each other. And so you could say that you have 3 different sorts of rights, and each of them you can look at from 4 different perspectives, right? Kant himself does point this out mainly when it comes to the categories of relation and the categories of modality. That is, the first category of relation, the item right, corresponds to the first category of modality, to the possible agreement of choices. Because if you go pick an item out there in nature and say, this is mine now, it is possible for others to agree, but they haven't agreed yet. The personal right, the second, corresponds to the actual agreement, because it is based on a contract, right? So on you and someone else actually agreeing with each other that you have a right to these actions of him. And then the third, the personal right in the manner of an item, corresponds to the necessary agreement, because it can only be according to a law, Kant would say, right? Like if we were in the state of nature without there being a state, we could own items, even though only provisionally, without being sure that others accept this ownership. And we could also form contracts with others, even though they could always break them and we could not enforce it. But there couldn't be marriage, for example. Of course, there could be a man and a woman living together, having sex, having children, but there could be no marriage as a legal institution except within a legal framework, except within a state. And this also corresponds to necessity, because while, of course, it is not necessary that 2 people marry, if they want to be married, then for that it is necessary that their choices align, right? They both must say, yes, I do. Likewise with the house servants, right? It is, of course, not necessary that you take servants into your house, but if this sort of relation is to exist, it can only exist. It is necessary for its existence that all the involved people agree with their free choice. While for the relationship between me and an item, for me owning an item, it is not necessary that everyone else agrees. That is only necessary if I want my right to that item to really be secure. So that is, as far as Kant says it, relating the 3 categories of relation and the 3 categories of modality. But if you think about it, this is also true for the other 2 titles, right? Like, take the 3 categories of quantity. Here you will also find that taking an item where you acquire only a possible right, that can be done by just one choice, by just your own. Forming a contract, thereby acquiring an actual right to someone's actions, that needs more than one choice involved. While having a legal familial relationship, a legal domestic relationship with your spouse or with your house servants, that requires a a state, a legal framework, and therefore the agreement of all the choices. And lastly, with the categories of quantity, it's once again the same thing, right? To take an item and say, this is mine, here you acquire a right, while if you form a contract to give somebody else something, be it an item or be it some sort of service you promise to him, here you give away a right. A right that you previously had is now transferred to the other person. And in the last instance, you have the limitation of persons' rights, right? In the third instance, when they are part of a domestic community. So that is why the private right, insofar as it deals not with the innate human rights we have, but with our acquired intellectual rights, with our intellectual property, why that, according to Kant, comes down to basically three areas of right, which is this item right, this personal right, and this personal right in the manner of an item. And what Kant's claim is that through this table of the categories of rights, he has described all possible just rights that can exist. Right? That is what the table of categories is about. Once again, I advise you to listen to my lecture about the table of categories and also to the following lecture about the table of categories as a key to Kant's whole system. That is always the claim. Kant says that all thinking is connecting. We have 12 manners. This is just, once again, the structure of our thinking faculty. We have 12 manners in which we can connect. From there arise these 12 categories, the 12 basic concepts of connections, you could say. And therefore, everything we can possibly think must be described in these categories. And with the general table of categories, the ontological table of categories, Kant says you cannot possibly think of anything, whether something that exists or doesn't exist, without thinking it within these 12 categories. For example, you can think of no other quantity except something being one, something there being many of one and the same sort, or there being a totality, there being all the things. Or likewise, you cannot think of any fourth relation. You can only think of the relation a thing has with its own attributes, of the relation a cause has with its effect, or of the relation of a community, that is the relation of the parts of a whole with each other and with the whole. And just like that, just like Kant says, you cannot possibly think any object except through these 12 categories. Kant also says you cannot possibly think of any right. And to him, all the rights are about the mine and yours, so about property, meaning you cannot possibly think about owning something except through these 12 categories. So if you say I own something, then if we go with the categories of quantity, that can only mean that you want to own this, no matter whether others have agreed yet or not. Or it can mean that someone else has agreed that you own this. Or it can mean that the law says you own this and therefore everyone must agree that you own this. There's no fourth option, Kant would say. Or likewise, when we go with relation, if you say, I own something, Kant would say that can only mean I own something as an item. This item with its substance is mine. Or you can say, you can mean I own a person's effect, I own a person's actions, not a person as such, but certain actions that he can do were promised to me through contract, and now I have a right to them. Or you can mean I own this person without him stopping to be a person. I own him as if he was an item without having the right to use him as an item. And there is no fourth possibility, once again. So this is the claim that Kant makes. You can think for yourself whether you can think of another sort of just right, another sort of property of ownership that does not fall within these 12 categories. But Kant would claim this table of categories describes all just legal relations that could possibly exist. This is not yet all there is to say, however. There's one thing that remains, and this is the schematism of the right. And here, to understand this better, I advise that you first listen to my lecture on the schematism and the principles, because that will very much help you understand this better. Kant is saying that all thinking is connecting. And once again, we connect in these 12 manners. That is why we can describe it according to the table of categories. But as I already mentioned, it is one of Kant's most important insights that discursive thinking as such is completely empty. One of the most famous, and rightfully so, one of the most important quotes of Kant's is him saying that while viewing without concepts is blind, because you don't know what it is you're viewing if you don't think about it. On the other hand, thoughts, that is concepts without viewing, are empty. Kant's point is that while we can think independently of our sensuality, that thinking is empty and meaningless without sensuality. That is, we don't know if what we thought has any reality to it, has any meaning. We cannot even understand our own thoughts. Take the regular table of categories, that is the ontological table of categories. Let's go with the categories of relation. First, you have substance and accidents. Now, if we only go with thinking, if we completely abstract from sensuality and only ask what do we think when we think of something as a substance and something as an accident, then the definition, that which we think, the rule, so to say, because once again, all concepts are rules, sorts of rules, is that the substance is something existing on its own, while the accident is something existing only as part of that substance. Now that is the thought you have. But if you just take this thought, you have no idea what this is supposed to mean. Like, how would you know that something exists on its own and is therefore a substance? How would you know if there even is such a thing as substances? Like, maybe nothing can exist on its own, right? Or likewise, if you take the category of causality, if you just go with the definition, if what you are thinking here is that causality is when something exists because another thing exists. So simply by positing A, we automatically posit B. That is what it means, that B is the effect and A is the cause. Once again, what is that supposed to mean? Like, how would you ever know that some B that exists because of and therefore as the effect of some A? And how would you know that this can even be? How do you know that causality can even exist? I mean, maybe this is a category of our thinking. Maybe because of the structure of our intellect, we cannot help but have causality as one of the thoughts we can have. But without causality outside of our empty thinking actually be a thing, right? Maybe there is no case in the world where some B exists simply because something else, some A, exists. So the categories as such are empty. And that is why the schematism is needed. The schema is created by sensuality underlaying the category. We need sensuality, and in the case of the ontological categories, that means time for Kant, to sort of fill these categories and give them meaning and make them sort of applicable to experience, to the sensual world, right? Because if you add the element of time, and then suddenly these categories make sense, right? If you add to the definition of substance, that substance exists independently while an accident exists only as an attribute of that substance. If you add the element of time, then you get substance is that which remains through time, while the accident is that which can change in time, right? Otherwise, you never know which thing is the substance and which is the accident. Like, take my t-shirt. You could say that t-shirt is substance and red is its accident, but you could also claim that red is the substance and t-shirtness is an accident of the red hood. But if you add the element of time, you understand that the t-shirt could change its color and would still remain. And then you realize that there is no red hood as an independent substance, but rather that the t-shirt is the substance and the color is just its accident. Likewise with the category of causality, right? If you add the element of time to the definition that something B exists simply because something else A exists, then you can now say if A happens first in time and then B follows in time, and it follows with necessity, that is, it follows always, because, right, it could also follow by coincidence, like maybe some dog will bark and then the next moment an apple will fall down from the tree. That does not mean that there's a causal relationship, because the barking came first, but maybe next time the dog barks, no apple will fall down. And maybe the time after that, an apple will fall down and the dog will bark afterward. Only if A always comes first, and if B always, without exception, follows when A happens, then you know that there's a causal relationship here. So that is the schematism. That is Kant saying that we can think with just the categories as such, but those thoughts are empty. We don't really know what we are thinking, and we don't really know if we are really thinking something, if there's any reality to it. And only if we add a central element, the element of time, only if we sort of put the central schema underneath the category, can we apply the category to the central world. Well, the same is true for the categories of right. Kant would say that with these 12 categories, we can think intellectual property. That is, we can think a relationship between our choice and some object of our choice, something we may choose, as that object being owned by us. we can think that completely independently of any sensuality, right? Like with the category of the item right, I can think of an item belonging to me without any sensual connection. Like I can say this house is mine, even if I'm not currently inside that house. Maybe I'm even on another continent or I fly to another planet and I can still say this is mine. Uh, this is no problem. But still, Kant would say here too, we need a central element to really apply our 12 concepts of rights. And that central element is the acquisition of a right. Because all these types of rights that are described in this table of category, let me remind you, they are all acquired rights, right? This is not about the innate rights you are born with, the rights to that which you own by birth, like to your own body. This is about rights you acquire. And the point is that once you have acquired a right, there is no issue thinking of that right without sensuality. So once you have acquired a right to a house, once you own that house, there's no problem thinking of you as the owner, even without being physically connected to that house, even without being currently at home. But the question is, how did you acquire that right in the first place? Since you were not born with it, how did you come into that right? And that is something that without sensuality coming into it at all, we cannot properly think, right? Like imagine if someone was saying, I own that planet out there 3 galaxies away. Now he could say so. Who's to stop him, or who's to even care? But if he was serious about that, owning some faraway planet, or maybe just one walk on that planet, without ever having been there, without ever having occupied it, without ever having made it his, that would be ridiculous. And if we did someday develop the technology to fly to that planet 3 galaxies away, and I said that this specific walk on that planet is mine, and now someone else flies there and takes this walk and takes it with him and says, this is my walk now, and I were to complain and say, no, but I said this was my walk, then that person could reply, yeah, you said that, but that was just a thought. It was just an empty thought, but you never truly made it yours. It was still a walk that belonged to nobody, and I was there first. I was the first to apprehend that walk. And therefore it is not yours, even though you claimed it as yours, rather it is mine. So again, not for the ownership, once it has been established, is sensuality needed. Here the 12 categories are enough. But sensuality, Kant says, is needed for acquisition, for us coming into a right. So in order to be able to use, to apply our concepts that our thinking alone gives us, our concepts of ownership, of rights, in order to apply them to actual sensual things, we need a schema of the right. And these schemata, Kant says, are what makes acquisition possible or thinkable. They are, as he says, the schemata of the rights, or they are, you could say, the physical conditions of the acquisition of property, of the acquisition of a right. And since there are these 3 types of rights, there are also 3 types of schemata. First, you have the item right. And the schema of the item right, that's through which we acquire the right to an item, is what Kant calls the grabbing or the apprehension of that item. I will point out that apprehension is also an important term in Kant's epistemology, and I already made a lecture about that, and this has nothing to do with each other, right? In epistemology, by apprehension, Kant means our faculty of imagination apprehending all the different sensations we have, all the sense impressions, the colors and sounds and so on, and putting them together into an image. Here he also uses the word apprehension, but it means something completely else. It means, well, that's why I also said grabbing. It means literally apprehending an item, right? So again, plucking, for example, the apple from the tree. If the tree and the apples didn't belong to anyone before, now I can grab it, and thereby this is the schema of making it mine under the item right. Now, after having grabbed it, I can put it away and it can still be mine, even though it's not in my hand anymore. But at some point, I must have physically apprehended something in order to have acquired a right to that item. I must have grabbed that thing, or I must have occupied that ground, if we are talking about land ownership, in order to make it mine. Second, if we look at personal right, here Kant says the schema is the acceptation, as he calls it, of the contract. So I make a contract with someone promises some action to me, and now I accept his promise. I accept this contract, and that is the schema of me acquiring a right to this action, right? Before I had no right to that action. I could not just demand from a random person, hey, you must do this action for me. And even if the person promised that action to me, I can now maybe on ethical grounds make a demand. I can say, you mustn't break your promise. That would make you a bad person, but not on legal grounds. On legal grounds, I acquired the right to that action promised to me the moment I accepted that promise. So that means both schemata are essential, but the schema of the item right, the apprehension, is space, right? I need to at some point have been connected with that item in space, have grabbed it in space. And second, the schema of the personal right is time. I need at some point in time to have accepted this promise made to me. As a side note, someone could criticize Kant here and say that it is also possible to acquire an item without ever having been connected to it in space. And especially nowadays with online shopping, we do that all the time. But here Kant would say, while at the end you acquire an item right, the acquisition here happens through personal right? You acquire a right to that item because first off, when you buy it from someone, you acquire a right to that someone's action. You form a contract with that person where he agrees to deliver you that item. So it is that action which you gain a right to, not the item as such. And only through that action, because the action is the delivery or the gifting to you of an item, through that action do you acquire the item. So these are the two possibilities. And then lastly, the personal right in the manner of an item. Here the schema is called the subjection by Kant. And here the schema happens both in time and space, right? If you marry, for example, you should be at the same space, and at the same time, your partner should say, yes, I do, and you should accept this promise of marriage, right? So just like the third category for Kant is always the combination of the first two, the category of community being a combination of substance and accidents and of causality. So the third schema is a combination of the other two. The subjection in time and space is a combination of the apprehension in space and of the acceptation in time. Kant says it is the acceptation that has become necessary through apprehension. So through making someone your wife or making someone your servant, through sort of grabbing them, so to say, you have made it necessary for yourself to also accept their promise of marriage or their promise of servitude, because otherwise you could not apprehend them. And only through these three schemata can we acquire these three rights. So while the rights as such are intellectual or supersensual, or some connection we just think that doesn't require time and space, right? I can own an item even while being removed from it in space, and I can own an action, that is, I can have a contractual right to a certain service even while being removed in time from the moment when it was promised to me. Originally, such rights cannot be acquired completely independently from sensuality. Originally, they do need time and space. Well, with that, I am done with describing these acquired rights, what sort of acquired rights within the framework of private rights there are. And I could now move on to what Kant calls the public right, because all of what I described here and also in the previous lecture, all of that is fine and well, but of course, it is all provisional. Like, no one is forced to grant us our rights and to respect our rights, right? Which is why the right needs to become public. That is, there needs to be a public declaration of who has which rights, who owns what, and there needs to be some sort of state that enforces these rights. But before I get to that, I want to remain for one more lecture within the framework of private right, because there's still one important question remaining unanswered, and that is the question of what the philosophy of right called original acquisition. Because so far I have said, okay, according to Kant, you don't just have these innate human rights, you also can acquire rights. You can something can become your property. And we can think, that's what I described now, we can think of this property in 12 manners. But the question is, how does this work originally? Right? How, and that is indeed a main question for the philosophy of right, because if you think about it, it's a big question. How can something that was not yours become legally yours? Not just how can you claim it, how can you say this is mine now? That doesn't need much explanation, but how can that be justified? And here the three schemata I just described are not enough to explain this, right? The schemata are a necessary condition for acquiring. Like, you cannot acquire a right without these three essential conditions. But even with them, it doesn't explain how the first person acquired a right? Like when there is already property, it's not hard to explain how something that is somebody else's property could become mine if he gives it to me. But how did it become his? Maybe he bought it from somebody else and so on. But how did the first person make something his property, and how was he justified in that? And I mean, once again, if you take the schema of the item right, that is the apprehension in space, grabbing something, still, how does that make it yours? We can understand that the apple on the tree cannot become mine without me having plucked it, that this is a necessary condition, but even with me plucking it, why does that make it mine so that the apple stays mine even when I put it out of my hand again? This is still something, so the origin, so to say, of property, that is still something that needs to be explained. And so I want to spend the next lecture talking about what Kant has to say about that, before then moving on to the public right. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Leo Allmann, Thomas Doringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Yasin Özün, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Ron Suhl, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.